What if the loudest laugh in Hollywood hid the quietest regret? What if the man who made millions laugh stayed silent while his closest friend lived in fear? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if that silence mattered more than anyone wants to admit? Before the headlines, before the flashing police lights, before the words multiple sharp force injuries froze an entire industry in disbelief, there was a phone call, a promise, and a secret that, according to Billy Crystal, should never have stayed buried. This is not a story about jokes. It's not a story about movies. It's a story about fear, loyalty, and the kind of truth that comes too late. And it begins with a sentence Billy Crystal now says he wishes he never ignored. "I'm sorry I lied." Those 4 words didn't come during a press conference. They didn't come on a red carpet. They didn't come while cameras were rolling. They came in private, after the deaths, after the arrest, after the dream Rob Reiner allegedly described years earlier had, in a way no one expected, collided with reality. But let's slow down. Because to understand why this matters, why it matters now, you have to understand the bond between 2 men who trusted each other more than almost anyone else in the world. Rob Reiner and Billy Crystal weren't just colleagues. They weren't just Hollywood friends who exchanged pleasantries at award shows. They were brothers by choice. For decades, they shared dinners, phone calls, frustrations, and fears that never made it into interviews. When Rob talked, Billy listened. When Billy joked, Rob understood what was hiding underneath the laugh. And that's what makes what happened next so unsettling. Because according to Billy Crystal, Rob Reiner didn't laugh when he told him this. He didn't joke. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't soften the words. He said he was afraid. Afraid in a way that kept him awake at night. Afraid in a way that followed him even in his sleep. Afraid of someone the world assumed was safe. And when Billy heard who Rob said he feared, he reportedly did what comedians do best. He tried to deflect. Because fear like that doesn't fit the Hollywood image. Fear like that doesn't belong in mansions and award ceremonies. Fear like that feels unthinkable. Ask yourself something honestly. If your best friend, someone powerful, respected, and deeply private, told you they feared their own family member, would you believe them? Or would you laugh it off and tell yourself it was stress? That's the question that now hangs over everything Billy Crystal has said, and everything he didn't say, for years. The story exploded into public view after authorities reported that filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were found dead in their Brentwood estate, victims of what the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner described as multiple sharp force injuries. 2 lives, 1 home, and a silence that suddenly felt deafening. Their son, Nick, who lived in the guest house on the property, was arrested that same night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The legal process is ongoing, and allegations remain allegations until proven in court. But once the arrest was announced, something else happened behind the scenes. Billy Crystal, Rob's closest confidant, allegedly broke. Because the thing Rob had once whispered to him, the thing Billy swore he would never repeat, no longer felt like a private fear. It felt like a warning. And warnings, ignored, have a way of haunting the people who hear them. Why is Billy speaking now? That's the question everyone keeps asking. Why didn't he say something earlier? Why didn't he come forward when the fears were first shared? Why wait until after the worst possible outcome? Billy's answer, according to those close to him, is both simple and devastating. He promised. Rob Reiner, by Billy's own admission, made him swear to keep it a secret. Not for the press, not for the public, not even for authorities. Because Rob didn't want his fear to become a story. He didn't want it misunderstood. He didn't want it sensationalized. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to believe it himself. Here's where this story gets uncomfortable. Because secrets don't just protect people. They isolate them. And Billy Crystal now claims that Rob told him about a recurring dream. Not once, not twice, but multiple times. A dream where fear took shape, where violence replayed itself, where Rob and Michelle didn't wake up. A dream Billy didn't know how to respond to. A dream Billy tried to rationalize away. A dream that, in hindsight, feels impossible to ignore. But hindsight is cruel like that, isn't it? It connects dots only after the picture is complete. At the time, Billy was a friend trying to be supportive. A comedian trying to lighten a heavy moment. A confidant who believed honoring a promise mattered more than asking uncomfortable questions. and now he's left with one. Would breaking that promise have changed anything? That question sits at the center of this entire story, not as an accusation, not as a verdict, but as a haunting possibility. Hollywood thrives on narratives of heroes and villains, good guys and bad guys. But this story doesn't fit neatly into that box. Because Billy Crystal isn't accused of committing a crime. He isn't accused of enabling violence. He is accused, by himself, of staying silent. And silence, as history has shown again and again, can be just as powerful as action. Especially when fear is involved. The media response was immediate and relentless. Headlines focused on the arrest. Speculation flooded social media. Every detail of the estate, the family, and their past was dissected. But almost no one talked about Billy. Not at first. Because Billy Crystal had always been the safe one. The funny one. The guy who hosted award shows and kept things light. Until the whispers started. Until people close to him noticed the change. The weight. The sleeplessness. The way he avoided certain questions. And eventually, according to those accounts, the truth slipped out. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But in fragments. I should have said something. He was scared. I promised him. Those fragments paint a picture that is deeply human and deeply tragic. A man caught between loyalty and responsibility. A promise made in love that became a burden in grief. And a realization that some secrets, once kept, can never truly be forgiven. Not by the public, and not by yourself. So why does this story matter now? Because it forces a question most people don't want to answer. When someone you love confesses fear, real fear, do you protect the secret or the person? There is no easy answer. And that's what makes this story so powerful. It's not about proving guilt. It's not about rewriting legal outcomes. It's about confronting the uncomfortable gray space between right and wrong. Billy Crystal says he lied. Not to hurt anyone. Not to deceive the world. But to honor a promise he believed was sacred. And now that promise sits next to 2 graves and 1 prison cell. As we move forward, we're going to break this story down carefully. Not to sensationalize it. Not to exploit tragedy. But to understand how fear, silence, and loyalty collided in a way no one expected. In the next section, we'll go back to the beginning. Before the fear. Before the dreams. Before the promise. We'll explore the friendship that defined a generation, and why Rob Reiner trusted Billy Crystal with the one thing he told no one else. Because once you understand that bond, everything that follows becomes even more chilling. And what Rob said next is something Billy Crystal says he can still hear in his sleep. What do 2 men in Hollywood, both larger than life in their own ways, do when they find a rare kind of connection? Laugh, argue, celebrate, confide. And if the story of Rob Reiner and Billy Crystal is any indication, trust each other with secrets that no one else could possibly understand. Before the headlines, before the tragedy, before the chilling calls and promises, there were decades of shared history. And it's in that history that we begin to see the weight of what came next. Rob Reiner was, by all accounts, a powerhouse in the entertainment world. Director, actor, writer, producer. A man whose name alone could open doors in Hollywood, whose films shaped generations. Billy Crystal, meanwhile, was the embodiment of comedic timing and public charm, a performer capable of turning almost any gathering into a stage. On paper, they were just 2 successful men in an industry that thrives on connections. But in reality, their friendship ran much deeper. They met in a way that seems almost too cinematic to be real. Both young, ambitious, and brimming with energy, they quickly recognized in each other a kind of understanding that Hollywood rarely offers. A friend who sees beyond the persona. A friend who could laugh with them and, more importantly, hear their fears without judgment. Early collaborations, casual dinners, birthday parties, and late-night conversations formed a bond that was more brotherhood than mere acquaintance. And with that bond came trust. The kind that allows for confessions, for fears, and for whispered warnings that never make it into public interviews. Imagine them sitting together in a dimly lit room, the noise of Hollywood muffled outside the door. Rob, meticulous, introspective, and sometimes haunted by overthinking, would talk about projects, ideas, and yes, even fears. Billy, with his trademark humor, would listen, punctuate with a well-timed joke, and provide the kind of emotional anchor that makes confidences safe. This friendship was built on years of observation, mutual respect, and the knowledge that what was shared stayed private. And then, as friendships often do, it deepened. Moments that were trivial in the eyes of the public, a phone call about a script, a dinner after a screening, were actually layered with trust. They spoke about family. They spoke about their work. They spoke about life in a way that few in Hollywood can, because so much of Hollywood is performance. But between Rob and Billy, there was no performance. There was sincerity. And that sincerity was why Rob eventually confided a fear so intimate, so raw, that it would change the trajectory of their lives forever. It was during one of those late-night conversations, the kind that starts with laughter and ends in contemplation, that Rob allegedly revealed something terrifying. He spoke of Nick, his son, in a way that shocked Billy, not because Rob didn't love him, but because Rob was afraid. He told Billy that he had recurring dreams, haunting, vivid, and violent, where he and Michelle were harmed by Nick. He described patterns, feelings, and scenarios that no father should ever imagine. And then he made Billy swear a promise that he would never tell anyone, under any circumstances. Billy Crystal, being the loyal friend he was, agreed. He swore to keep the secret, and for years he did. He carried the knowledge silently, balancing the line between loyalty and moral obligation, unsure whether disclosure would protect Rob or betray him. He had become a confidant in the truest sense, one who listens without judgment, who holds a secret that could not only devastate a family, but redefine the public's understanding of a tragedy that would later unfold. In a world like Hollywood, such trust is rare. People speak, rumors travel, and loyalty is often transactional. But between Rob and Billy, it was absolute. This context is critical because it frames everything that comes after. It was this bond, this promise, and this understanding of confidentiality that later forced Billy into a moral quandary unlike any he had faced before. It's important to pause here and recognize the subtle layers of their friendship. Beyond laughter, beyond joint appearances and mutual accolades, there existed a psychological intimacy. One that allowed Rob to articulate a fear that was profoundly personal. One that forced Billy to reconcile his role as a friend with his own ethical compass. In those private moments, the duo navigated a space few ever see, a space where love, trust, and fear intersect. Yet, even within this closeness, there were contradictions. Rob Reiner was confident, decisive, and often publicly unflappable. But behind closed doors, he was cautious, haunted, and occasionally paralyzed by dread. Billy Crystal, on the other hand, was outwardly gregarious and unshakable, but inside, he carried a sense of responsibility that few could see. These contradictions, layered over decades of friendship, are what made the eventual tragedy all the more devastating. They underscore a chilling reality. Knowing someone's fear doesn't always equate to preventing harm, even when you are closest to them. And there's one more piece that cannot be ignored: the timing. The friendship itself did not suddenly cause tragedy. It did not create violence. But it placed Billy Crystal in a unique, almost impossible position. He had knowledge that, if revealed earlier, might have altered public perception or even legal proceedings. Yet he had also promised secrecy. This tension, this collision between loyalty and ethical responsibility, is a core theme that runs throughout the events that followed. Consider, for a moment, the psychological weight of this promise. Imagine carrying, day after day, a secret so profound that it shadows your interactions, dictates your conversations, and even alters your sleep patterns. Billy Crystal's silence was not passive, it was active labor, a mental and emotional effort to maintain composure while holding onto information that, by its nature, demanded disclosure. It's the kind of burden that transforms a person slowly, imperceptibly, until the eventual breaking point becomes inevitable. And now, in hindsight, we can see how this friendship, so rich and trusting, became intertwined with tragedy. The laughter, the mutual respect, the decades of shared history, all of it created the context for one of Hollywood's most chilling stories. A context in which fear, love, and loyalty collided, leaving consequences that neither man could have predicted. The bond between Rob Reiner and Billy Crystal was not ordinary. It was profound, tested, and ultimately, it was the very thing that made the ensuing silence so consequential. This friendship is the lens through which we must examine the events that followed, because it provides the only window into the private fears, whispered confessions, and moral dilemmas that shaped the story. And what Rob reportedly said next would change everything. He described the recurring dream. He described the fear. He described a possibility that no parent ever wants to confront. And Billy Crystal, despite his instincts, despite the alarm bells ringing in his head, kept the promise. That promise would haunt him for years. It would shape his public statements, his personal reflections, and, ultimately, his confessions. Rob Reiner never joked when he said this. That's the first thing Billy Crystal reportedly noticed the night his best friend's voice changed. Deepened with unease, tempered by a caution that demanded attention. The laughter that normally accompanied their late-night conversations was gone. It was replaced by something heavier, something that hinted at a fear Rob could barely put into words. It began innocuously enough. They were sitting in Rob's private study, a room lined with books, scripts, and framed memories of a career that spanned decades. The soft glow of lamps cast shadows across the walls, and the hum of Los Angeles traffic outside felt distant. But inside that room, time seemed to contract. What normally would have been casual banter turned into something more serious. Billy remembered the exact phrasing, at least in fragments. Rob leaned forward, eyes fixed on some distant point, as if seeing the future he feared. He said, simply, "Billy, I'm scared of Nick." Billy's first reaction was disbelief. Not shock, not fear, but disbelief. A father afraid of his own son? The idea felt impossible, even absurd. And like many of us do when confronted with ideas that jar our worldview, Billy laughed. Just a little, nervously, trying to keep the moment light. Rob didn't laugh back. He didn't even smile. "Don't laugh at this," he said. And in that simple statement, the gravity of the conversation crystallized. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't hyperbole. Rob was serious, terrifyingly serious. He went on to describe the dreams. Recurring, vivid, detailed dreams in which he and Michelle were in danger. Night after night, he would awake with a start, drenched in sweat, heart racing, unsure if the terror was reality or figment. And in these dreams, according to Rob, Nick was always present, not as a mischievous child, not as a typical rebellious teen, but as the focal point of a scenario that played out with violent precision. Billy listened, and somewhere between the disbelief and the mounting concern, he felt a knot in his stomach. This was uncharted territory. No friend, no matter how close, should be asked to bear the burden of another person's fear of their own family member. Yet here he was, hearing Rob describe what he believed was possible, what he feared might come true. Rob went further, explaining that these weren't fleeting nightmares. They were visions, repeated over years, persistent in their detail. The house, the rooms, the conversations, they were all the same. Michelle's presence, too, was consistent. In every version of the dream, she was by his side, vulnerable and helpless. And Rob would wake, gasping, certain of a danger he couldn't control. Billy's mind raced. He wanted to ask questions, to probe, to challenge the dream. But he didn't, because he understood that sometimes the value of friendship is not in interrogation but in presence, in listening, in silent acknowledgement. And yet, the moral conflict was immediate. Because when someone tells you they fear another human being, especially someone they love, you're suddenly faced with a choice. Do you intervene? Do you tell someone? Or do you honor a promise of secrecy, even when the stakes feel impossibly high? Rob's request was clear. Billy had to swear. To never, under any circumstances, reveal what he had just heard. Not to the family, not to the authorities, not even to mutual friends who might be concerned. This was a pact born of trust, yes, but also of fear. Rob wanted to contain the terror, to keep it within the walls of his home, within the vault of his mind, and within the mind of the only person he believed could understand without judgment. Billy swore, and in that act, he shouldered a weight that would follow him for years. A promise that, according to him, would later feel like both a blessing and a curse. Over the next hours, they discussed nothing about the practicalities of the fear. No plans, no contingencies. Just the acknowledgement of the dream and the fear. It was almost ceremonial in its solemnity. And when they finally left the room, both men carried with them a quiet tension, a sense that the world outside could never know what had just been shared. Billy would later describe these moments as surreal, not because the content was unbelievable, but because the intimacy of the confession was so raw, so private. Hollywood thrives on spectacle, on public image, on controlled narratives. But here, in that study, there was no spectacle. There was only fear, and a friendship tested in a way that few ever experience. And then came the rationalizations. Because humans rarely allow themselves to accept terror in its raw form. Billy told himself that dreams are just dreams. That Rob was overworked. That stress, not reality, shaped these visions. That nothing would ever come of it. And for years, he clung to this rationalization, not out of disloyalty, but out of necessity. It's important to understand this dynamic. For Billy, this was not a single moment of silence. It was the beginning of a long, psychological odyssey. Each year added layers to the promise. Each interaction with Rob reinforced the importance of discretion, and each personal reflection forced Billy to wrestle with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Yet, despite the reassurances and the rationalizations, Billy never forgot the look on Rob's face. The subtle tremor in his hands. The slight tension in his jaw. The way his eyes darted as he spoke. It was all evidence that, whatever the world might say, Rob's fear was real. And here is where the story deepens. Because fear, when unshared, grows. It mutates. It becomes something larger, something almost tangible, influencing decisions, conversations, and relationships. For Billy, being a confidant was no longer a role of simple friendship. It became a moral crucible, testing his sense of right and wrong, loyalty and responsibility, comedy and tragedy. And yet, life continued. Hollywood moved forward. Rob continued to direct. Billy continued to perform. The public saw nothing. And that, according to those closest to Billy, made the eventual breaking point all the more devastating. Because secrecy has a cost. And the cost in this case was both emotional and psychological. Billy carried the fear silently, negotiating with himself every time he met someone who might unknowingly reference Rob's family. Every joke he made on stage or on camera contained a shadow of tension, a hidden weight that no audience would ever detect. And yet, he endured it, honoring a promise he believed was sacred. But promises are complicated things, especially when the subject of the promise involves life, death, and unimaginable consequences. In that room, in that study, in that conversation where Rob warned Billy Crystal and asked for his silence, something shifted. The friendship remained, yes. But it was no longer just about camaraderie and shared laughter. It was now about trust tested by fear, trust challenged by secrecy, trust weighed against morality. And while the world would never know the details of this conversation, at least, not until Billy decided otherwise, the implications were profound. This was a moment that would echo through the lives of everyone involved, shaping actions, regrets, and decisions for years to come. And what happened after that conversation is something that would stay with Billy Crystal for decades, a haunting presence that even now he reportedly says he cannot forget. It wasn't a nightmare, it was a warning. That's how Billy Crystal reportedly remembers Rob Reiner describing it. A dream that returned night after night, each iteration more vivid, more terrifying, and more impossible to dismiss. For Rob, sleep was no longer a refuge. It had become a stage for fear, a place where his mind replayed what he most dreaded, over and over, in excruciating detail. Billy remembers the first time Rob spoke about it. They were in the quiet of Rob's home, away from cameras, away from industry friends, away from anyone who might not understand the depth of what he was revealing. Rob's voice was calm, almost eerily so, but underneath it was an unmistakable tremor. The tremor of a man haunted by his own imagination, or perhaps by a premonition. In the dream, he said, the house was the same as it had always been. The familiar rooms of Brentwood, the very rooms where family life normally thrived. Yet in the dream, every corner held danger. Michelle was always there, calm at first, but gradually aware that something was wrong. And Nick, their son, appeared not as a child who needed guidance, but as the source of the threat itself. Billy listened, unable to interrupt. Humor, the tool he wielded so masterfully in public, felt useless here. The images Rob described were too precise, too consistent, too disturbing. He painted them vividly. The way the light fell across the room, the subtle sounds in the hallways, the sense of inevitability that clung to every movement. According to Rob, the dream always ended the same way. Fear realized, harm done, helplessness inescapable. And yet, he emphasized, it was more than just a dream. It was a recurring pattern, a psychological echo that lingered in his waking mind. Every morning, he awoke with a racing heart, a dry mouth, and the same gnawing question. Could this actually happen? Or was it a mind spinning out of control, a cruel trick of imagination and anxiety? Billy, being Billy, wanted to rationalize it. Dreams are rarely prophetic. Dreams are the mind's way of processing stress, work, and life. But even as he told himself that, he couldn't shake the intensity in Rob's eyes, the subtle tension in his posture, the way he had spoken as though believing the dream might be more than mere fantasy. It's worth pausing here. Dreams are personal, but recurring dreams, especially ones laden with danger and fear, carry a unique psychological weight. For Rob, the repetition transformed anxiety into something tangible, something almost real. And for Billy, being the confidant meant carrying a reflection of that fear as well. Imagine living in the shadow of someone else's terror, night after night, without the ability to act. That is precisely what Billy would later describe as a kind of silent imprisonment. Rob's dreams weren't random. They contained patterns. Certain rooms, certain gestures, certain phrases repeated with almost obsessive precision. He described the fear of loss, of helplessness, and of betrayal, wrapped into scenarios that Billy could neither fully comprehend nor dismiss. And yet, he listened. Because in friendship, sometimes listening is the most radical act of love. Billy later admitted that he began keeping mental notes, not for legal purposes, not to intervene, but simply to remember the details. Every nuance mattered, because Rob himself seemed haunted not just by the possibility of danger, but by the exact ways it might manifest. Every nuance, every repeated action in the dream, built a mental map of fear that no one else in the world knew existed. And then came the moral tension. Because listening was one thing, but understanding that these were fears about a loved one, your best friend's child, changes the dynamic entirely. The ethical stakes rose dramatically. At this point, Billy was no longer merely a friend in the casual sense. He had become a guardian of secrets that could alter the course of events, should they ever be revealed. The recurring nature of the dream compounded the tension. It was not a single, fleeting fear. It was persistent, almost obsessive. Rob reportedly told Billy that the repetition itself was terrifying, the sense that he couldn't escape, that even in sleep, his mind betrayed him. And as a friend, Billy had to absorb this without offering solutions, without breaking the promise of secrecy. He had to witness the unfolding of a nightmare that only one person could see, and that person trusted him utterly. Billy tried to contextualize it. Perhaps Rob was stressed. Perhaps he was overworked. Perhaps the dream symbolized something else entirely. Fear of failure, fear of losing control, fear of family conflict. Rational explanations abounded, yet none could erase the intensity of Rob's own conviction. And that, in itself, added to the weight Billy carried. The understanding that logic and reason had limits when confronted with the deeply personal terror of a friend. In recounting the dream, Rob allegedly described sensory details that made it feel real. The smell of the rooms, the subtle shifts in lighting, the sound of footsteps, the cadence of speech, the way Michelle reacted, the moments when Nick's intentions seemed unclear but ominous. These details were not fleeting. They were vivid, persistent, and unshakable. And each time Rob told Billy, it was as though he was reliving the nightmare, step by step, for the first time. And then, the confession that tied it all together. Rob feared that the dream was not just a dream. That it was a warning. That perhaps, in some unthinkable way, the scenarios he imagined could come true. He didn't elaborate on the mechanics of his fear. He didn't assign blame. He simply admitted the reality of his dread and asked Billy to take it seriously. Billy's internal struggle intensified. He wanted to believe it was just a dream, yet the sincerity, the fear, the insistence in Rob's voice made that impossible. And so, he carried it silently, weighing the ethical implications, weighing the promise he had made, weighing the potential consequences of inaction. Imagine the psychological load. A best friend tells you they fear someone they love. They describe recurrent dreams in which that fear is realized. They ask you to keep it secret. And you agree. It is not hyperbole to say that such knowledge can shape a person's life. Billy reportedly described it as an invisible chain, one that bound him to both loyalty and moral dilemma, creating a tension that would follow him for years. And yet, the story is not about despair alone. It is about trust, intimacy, and the way human relationships function under extreme conditions. The dream, terrifying as it was, also cemented a bond of reliance and shared understanding. It was an extraordinary window into the mind of a man who had achieved extraordinary success, yet could not escape the fears that plagued him in private. The weight of the recurring dream also foreshadowed the events to come, because fear, when unacknowledged publicly, often festers. When combined with silence, it can become destructive. And when combined with real-world action, events, decisions, family dynamics, the consequences are unpredictable. Billy Crystal, according to later accounts, never forgot these dreams. He remembered the details, the rhythm, the repetition, the terror. And each time he reflected on them, he felt the full weight of the promise he had made to keep them secret. But as haunting as the dreams were, the promise of silence was even more consuming. The two intertwined: fear and loyalty, terror and obligation. And the emotional stakes were now not just about friendship. They were about responsibility, conscience, and survival. And just when it seemed the conversation could not grow more intense, Rob made another request. Not legal, not formal, but moral. Do not tell anyone. Ever. Under no circumstances. And if the events in the dream ever came close to reality, you must hold the secret. Because the burden of this knowledge, he insisted, belonged only to those who were bound by trust and love. Billy Crystal agreed. And in that moment, the die was cast. He became a keeper of fear, a witness to an unspoken tragedy, and a participant in a silence that would later weigh heavier than any joke or applause. What Billy did not yet know, and what the dream did not reveal, was how much that silence would matter. How the recurring nightmares, the trust, and the promise would collide with reality in ways he could not imagine. That was when Billy made the promise. 4 simple words that would become a burden, a shield, and a source of relentless guilt for years to come. Promise me you won't tell. Rob Reiner's voice reportedly carried no room for negotiation, no subtlety, no hint of levity. It was quiet, firm, and final, the kind of request that transforms a casual conversation into a life-altering commitment. Imagine the scene. Late evening in Rob's home, the quiet punctuated only by the soft ticking of a clock, the rustle of papers, the distant hum of Los Angeles. Billy, accustomed to observing Rob's every subtle gesture, noticed the tension. Rob wasn't pacing, wasn't gesturing dramatically. He simply leaned forward, eyes steady, voice calm but filled with weight. And in that calmness, the enormity of the request became apparent. You have to promise, Rob said. Don't tell anyone. Billy's first instinct, perhaps like yours, might have been to ask why. Why the secrecy? Why the fear? Why the insistence? But Billy didn't. He understood, even then, that asking too many questions would violate the trust, would fracture the intimacy of the moment, would risk turning confessions into interrogations. So he simply nodded. I promise, he said. And in that moment, the nature of their friendship changed. It evolved from camaraderie to custodianship of fear. Billy had become the keeper of a secret so profound it could redefine lives. It was a commitment that carried moral weight, ethical tension, and a psychological burden that would grow heavier with each passing year. Why such secrecy? According to Billy, Rob feared the world misinterpreting his concerns. He feared that family, friends, or authorities might react in ways that would harm Michelle, harm Nick, or harm himself. In a world obsessed with scandal, speculation, and sensationalism, a confession like this could have unintended consequences. And so, Rob sought refuge in one person he trusted above all others. Billy Crystal, the consummate performer, was now thrust into a role he had never auditioned for: moral guardian. He had to navigate a treacherous emotional landscape with no roadmap. He had to honor the promise without becoming complicit in any eventual outcomes. He had to listen without intervening, all while the stakes of the secret grew silently but inexorably. The psychological impact of keeping such a promise cannot be overstated. Each passing year, each family gathering, each conversation that skirted around the topic became a test of endurance. Billy's public persona, outgoing, humorous, unshakable, masked a private tension that few could detect. It is a phenomenon psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the mental strain that occurs when actions conflict with knowledge, values, or emotions. Billy was living it in real time, a high-profile case study in moral and emotional conflict. What made the promise even more complicated was the recurring dream Rob had shared. Billy wasn't merely keeping a secret about a passing worry. He was safeguarding the intimate details of visions that hinted at potential danger. Every night that Rob described the dream, the imagery, the fear, the terror, it was as though Billy carried the burden of not one but two minds: his own rational instincts and Rob's persistent, night-haunting dread. And the promise wasn't a passive thing. It shaped behavior, conversations, and even public statements. According to later accounts, Billy would carefully navigate interviews, award shows, and public appearances, consciously avoiding topics that might reveal too much. He joked, smiled, and performed, all while internally managing a secret that could destabilize everything he publicly represented. The moral dimension of such a promise is complex. On one hand, there is loyalty, honoring a friend's trust, respecting privacy, and safeguarding someone else's fear. On the other, there is the ethical responsibility. What if the secret could prevent harm? What if disclosure might have changed the course of events? For years, Billy reportedly wrestled with this tension, analyzing every possible scenario, questioning every decision, replaying every conversation. It is important to understand that this was not a single moment of acquiescence. It was the beginning of years of vigilance, of navigating a friendship under the weight of extraordinary circumstances. The promise shaped not just Billy's understanding of his friend, but also his own moral compass. He had to reconcile the notion of loyalty with the reality of fear. He had to negotiate the invisible line between protection and complicity. Over time, the secrecy began to take its toll. Billy would reportedly wake in the middle of the night, haunted by fragments of conversations, the cadence of Rob's voice, the repeated emphasis on the dream. He would remember the exact phrasing. The calm but urgent insistence, the eyes that searched his own for understanding, the subtle tremor in the hands that betrayed underlying panic. Each recollection reinforced the weight of the promise, each memory a reminder of what was at stake. And yet, despite the psychological burden, Billy continued to honor the promise. He did not speak publicly about the dreams. He did not warn authorities. He did not confide in mutual friends. The secret remained locked inside him, carried silently through years of interviews, award shows, and casual encounters with people who had no idea of the tension lurking beneath the surface. It is here that the human dimension of the story becomes most apparent. Loyalty, trust, and secrecy are deeply intertwined in human relationships, but when paired with fear, they create a volatile emotional cocktail. Billy's promise was not simply a verbal commitment. It was a lived experience of moral and psychological endurance. Each day, each encounter, each memory of Rob's fear reinforced the binding nature of the pledge. And as the years passed, the recurring dream became more than a nocturnal disturbance. It became a symbol of what could go wrong, a reminder of the fragility of family, a premonition that demanded respect. Billy carried it silently, attempting to parse metaphor from reality, dream from warning, fear from inevitability. It was a burden that demanded vigilance, emotional fortitude, and ethical patience. But promises, no matter how sacred, have limits. Events beyond control can render them morally complicated. Circumstances can shift, and consequences can magnify in ways no one anticipates. And that is exactly what would happen. Because after years of quiet vigilance, after decades of honoring the trust Rob placed in him, Billy would eventually confront a reality that tested every instinct. every ethical judgment, and every ounce of loyalty he had maintained. And the truth of that promise, the magnitude of what it demanded, would eventually collide with reality in ways that no one could have predicted. What Billy did not yet know, and what no friend could have predicted, was that the secret he had sworn to keep would become central to a tragedy that would shock the world. Looking back, the clues were everywhere. And yet, in real time, few people noticed them. That's the cruel paradox of tragedy. The signs often exist, but they are subtle, easy to rationalize, or hidden behind ordinary routines. For Rob, Reiner, and Michelle, their lives were public, their home in Brentwood visible to friends, family, and neighbors. But behind the facade of wealth, laughter, and normalcy, there were subtle indicators that, in hindsight, hinted at fear, tension, and unease. Billy Crystal later admitted that he and Rob were not the only ones to notice changes in behavior. Close friends, family members, and even staff observed what they initially dismissed as stress or eccentricity. Rob was meticulous about his work, but over the years, his attention to detail sometimes tipped into hypervigilance. Small, seemingly trivial behaviors, locking doors more often, double-checking windows, reviewing schedules obsessively, were brushed aside as habit or the product of a meticulous mind. Rob and Michelle Reiner were found in their master bedroom, victims of multiple sharp force injuries. The Los Angeles County Medical Examiner confirmed the cause of death with clinical precision, yet for friends, family, and fans, it was almost impossible to comprehend. These were lives of achievement, laughter, and public admiration. And now, suddenly, they were gone. The arrest of Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son who lived in the guest house on the property, was swift. Charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, he became the focus of media scrutiny, legal investigation, and public speculation. Headlines screamed. Social media exploded. The narrative spun out faster than anyone could follow. But Billy Crystal, carrying a secret that had long been buried, now had to navigate this new reality with an almost unbearable weight. Imagine the phone call. Billy reportedly said it came at night, like a thunderclap. Friends reached out. Journalists pressed for statements. But Billy couldn't explain the full context. The dreams, the fear, the promise, none of it could be shared without breaking the sacred vow he had made to Rob. And yet, every instinct screamed that something had gone horribly wrong, that he had a responsibility that extended beyond friendship, beyond loyalty. In the hours and days that followed, Billy's internal conflict intensified. The ethical dilemma that had been a quiet burden for years suddenly became an impossible public reckoning. How could he honor a promise when the consequences of silence were now catastrophically real? How could he balance loyalty with the moral imperative to acknowledge a warning he had carried in secret? Those first moments were a blur of grief, shock, and disbelief. According to reports, Billy found himself replaying every conversation with Rob, every detail of the recurring dream, every subtle sign he had witnessed over the years. Each memory carried a painful weight, amplified by the realization that the private fears Rob had confided to him were now part of a public tragedy. Friends and colleagues later described Billy as somber, almost haunted, navigating a world that seemed suddenly fractured. His public appearances, interviews, and statements were measured, careful, and restrained. Humor, his lifelong tool for connection and relief, was replaced by reflection and quiet sorrow. The persona that audiences adored had to coexist with a private anguish few could imagine. And then came the media. Headlines framed the story in simple, digestible terms. Shocking crime, wealthy family, tragic ending. But Billy's perspective was more complicated. He knew the context, the dreams, the warnings that had gone unspoken. He understood the subtle signs that everyone else had dismissed. And he knew the personal toll of secrecy, of promises, of bearing knowledge that could never be fully disclosed. The juxtaposition was brutal. Public fascination with the case collided with private grief and moral reckoning. Billy had to navigate interviews, avoid speculation, and answer questions with precision, all while internally processing a complex web of loyalty, guilt, and sorrow. Each conversation, each press inquiry, each friendly encounter became a test of composure. And the promise he had made to Rob years earlier now seemed almost unbearably heavy. Friends noted the change in his demeanor. The once effervescent humorist now carried a gravity that reflected the magnitude of the tragedy. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully chosen word revealed a man wrestling with knowledge few could understand. And that knowledge, the intimate insight into Rob's fears, the recurring dreams, the secret promises, was inescapable. It was a silent companion in every interaction, a shadow of guilt and sorrow that refused to lift. It's also important to note the complexity of moral and ethical reflection in this context. Billy's promise had been made in good faith, grounded in trust and friendship. Yet the public tragedy forced a reevaluation. Could a promise of secrecy exist when lives had been lost? Could loyalty justify silence when the stakes escalated to irreversible consequences? These questions are not rhetorical. They are central to understanding the psychological and emotional weight Billy carried in the aftermath of that day. During this period, Billy reportedly engaged in private reflection, conversations with close confidants, and internal deliberation over how much to reveal, when, and in what form. Each decision carried potential consequences for public perception, legal proceedings, and the memory of Rob and Michelle. The pressure was immense, the ethical terrain treacherous. And yet, amidst the shock and the grief, the underlying narrative was undeniable. Rob had been afraid. He had confided in a friend. He had described recurring dreams that now, in the most horrifying way imaginable, seemed to intersect with reality. Billy had honored a promise, and now, in the aftermath, the enormity of that promise collided with events beyond his control. What makes this day even more chilling is the intersection of private knowledge and public tragedy. The dreams, the fears, the secret conversations, all had been contained, insulated from the world. But the moment the deaths were discovered, the context shifted. Knowledge that had been a private bond became a lens through which the tragedy would forever be interpreted. Billy Crystal found himself navigating not only grief, but also the complex moral landscape of promises kept and secrets held. And just when it seemed the events of that day could be processed, the ripple effects began to extend outward. Media scrutiny intensified. Legal inquiries deepened. Friends, family, and associates began piecing together fragments of context. And Billy, who had carried the weight silently for years, realized that the secret could no longer remain entirely hidden. Because the promise, sacred as it had been, now existed alongside an irrevocable reality. A reality that demanded reckoning, reflection, and, eventually, confession. And what Billy would later say, publicly and privately, about that day and the secret he carried, would shock even those who had long admired him. The world would later hear Billy Crystal say words that were both shocking and deeply human. "I'm sorry I lied." 4 simple words, yet laden with decades of silence, loyalty, fear, and moral conflict. For years, Billy had carried Rob Reiner's secret, the recurring nightmares, the fear of his own son, the promise he had made. And now, in the aftermath of tragedy, the weight of that secret could no longer remain entirely private. Imagine the moment he decided to speak. It wasn't a press conference, a publicity stunt, or a casual revelation. It was an internal reckoning, the culmination of years of sleepless nights, moral questioning, and emotional burden. Billy reportedly reflected endlessly on the implications of breaking his silence. To admit that Rob had feared Nick, to confess that he had been told of recurring dreams depicting harm, was to open himself, and Rob, posthumously, to scrutiny, judgment, and possibly backlash. Yet the necessity of truth had become undeniable. "I lied," he told close confidants. "Not to deceive, not to manipulate, but because I swore a promise." That promise had been sacred, binding, and absolute. But promises, no matter how honorable, exist within a human context, and human context includes consequences, morality, and the stark realities of life and death. Billy's admission was not just about confession. It was about reconciling loyalty with conscience, secrecy with truth, and friendship with responsibility. To understand the gravity of Billy's confession, we must revisit the nature of the secret he carried. Rob Reiner's recurring dreams were vivid, terrifying, and consistent. He described the house, the rooms, the presence of Michelle, and the imagined actions of Nick. He explicitly communicated his fear to Billy, asking him to keep it confidential. That level of trust is rare in any relationship, particularly one in the public eye. For decades, Billy honored that trust, balancing the emotional weight with ethical reflection. But when reality mirrored the fears once confined to private conversation, the scales shifted. Silence, once a protective mechanism, became morally complicated. The world had changed, irrevocably. Rob and Michelle were dead, and the circumstances of their deaths aligned, in eerie and tragic ways, with the fears Rob had shared. Billy was left navigating a treacherous landscape of grief, loyalty, public attention, and moral responsibility. The confession was layered. On one level, it was an admission of truth about Rob's fears. On another, it was a personal acknowledgement of the moral complexity of friendship. Billy did not intend to harm anyone with his silence, but he also recognized that secrecy had consequences. His public admission, delivered carefully and thoughtfully, was a release of decades-long tension. It was a moment of vulnerability from a man known for humor and charisma, now revealing the profound human reality of bearing a secret. Friends and colleagues were reportedly stunned by the depth of his revelation. The juxtaposition was almost unbearable. The vibrant entertainer, known for laughter and wit, disclosing a secret rooted in fear, dread, and intimate familial tension. It was a reminder that even those who seem invincible carry burdens unseen by the public. And in Billy's case, the burden was both extraordinary and uniquely tragic. Billy's confession also illuminated the unseen dimensions of human trust. He described the moral dilemma of balancing the promise he had made to Rob with the evolving reality of danger, fear, and death. He explained the internal debate. Could he have done anything differently? Should he have warned someone? Or was the promise absolute, an ethical anchor he could not break, even in the face of horror? The tension between loyalty and morality became a central theme in his reflection. The public response was intense. Audiences struggled to reconcile the image of Billy Crystal with the intimate reality he disclosed. Fans, journalists, and observers were confronted with a paradox. The entertainer who brought laughter for decades, now revealing a story of fear, secrecy, and moral complexity at the heart of a family tragedy. It was a humanizing moment, but also a deeply unsettling one, as it forced everyone to consider the hidden realities behind public personas. Billy's admission was also a study in timing and ethics. He reportedly waited until certain aspects of the case were public, until the truth of the deaths was undeniable, and until he could speak without causing additional harm. That delay, while necessary in his view, contributed to the perception of silence as complicity. And yet, the confession made clear, his silence had been a promise, a moral commitment, not an attempt to conceal or manipulate events. The weight of the confession extended beyond public perception. Internally, Billy experienced a mixture of relief, sorrow, guilt, and grief. Relief at finally releasing decades of silence. Sorrow for the loss of Rob and Michelle. Guilt over whether he could have acted differently. Grief for the family whose tragedy he had observed and partially understood in ways no one else could. It was a psychological and emotional storm, the kind few can truly comprehend. Billy's confession also reframed the narrative of Rob's fear. Where once it might have seemed irrational or hyperbolic, the tragic outcome lent a haunting clarity. The recurring dreams, once dismissed as imagination, were now seen as a prescient manifestation of deep concern. The private knowledge he carried cast a long shadow over public understanding, highlighting the invisible threads connecting fear, trust, and consequence. Even as Billy spoke publicly, there was an awareness that words could never fully convey the depth of the experience. He acknowledged the limitations of explanation, the impossibility of fully transmitting decades of emotional complexity, and the challenge of reconciling friendship with reality. And yet, the confession itself was transformative, a moment of moral clarity in an otherwise chaotic landscape. The significance of the confession cannot be overstated. It revealed the hidden dimensions of friendship, the burdens of secrecy, and the ways in which trust can intersect with tragedy. It also underscored a universal truth. Even the strongest bonds carry risk, and the weight of knowledge is both a gift and a burden. And as Billy would later reflect, this confession was not just about revealing Rob's fears, it was about honoring them. It was about acknowledging the depth of trust, the intensity of fear, and the extraordinary complexity of human relationships. In doing so, he also revealed a personal truth, that the cost of loyalty can be immense, and that sometimes, honesty comes not in the moment of the secret, but in the years that follow. But even after the confession, the story was far from complete. The implications of the revelation, the emotional reverberations, and the legal and personal consequences continued to unfold, leaving everyone, friends, family, and the public, grappling with questions that had no easy answers. After the confession, Billy Crystal reportedly found himself in an emotional labyrinth, one that no amount of humor, public acclaim, or years of performing could navigate. For decades, he had carried Rob Reiner's secret. The recurring nightmares, the fear of Nick, the promise he had sworn to keep. And now, in the wake of tragedy, the weight of that silence pressed down on him with unparalleled intensity. Guilt, in this context, is not simple. It is not a fleeting pang or a passing regret. It is multi-layered, a collision of moral responsibility, loyalty, and helplessness. Billy had promised Rob he would not tell anyone. That promise, sacred and binding, had governed his choices for years. And yet, the deaths of Rob and Michelle rendered the moral calculus infinitely more complicated. Every past decision was now a potential point of introspection. Could he have done more? Should he have intervened? Was keeping the secret truly the right thing? Psychologists often describe this kind of ethical dissonance as moral residue, the lingering psychological effect of choices made under extreme circumstances. For Billy, it manifested as sleepless nights, relentless self-questioning, and a sense that he was carrying not just Rob's fears but the weight of what unfolded in reality. It is one thing to honor a promise. It is another to face the consequences of silence when the worst-case scenario becomes real. Billy reportedly began retracing every conversation, every detail Rob had shared. The recurring dream, the vivid imagery, the consistent patterns, the specific fears of harm. Replayed in his mind, layer by layer. Each recollection was both a reminder of his loyalty and a source of anguish. He knew Rob's fear was genuine, yet he questioned whether his silence inadvertently allowed events to escalate beyond anyone's control. The guilt was compounded by the public nature of the tragedy. Media coverage, legal proceedings, and social speculation transformed private grief into a spectacle. Friends, colleagues, and fans sought answers, explanations, and narratives. And while the world viewed the story in headlines and soundbites, Billy was grappling with decades of intimate knowledge that few could ever fully understand. He reportedly struggled with the distinction between intention and outcome. His intentions had always been honorable, to honor a friend's trust, to protect Rob's fears, to maintain the sanctity of their private conversations. Yet the outcome, a tragedy that claimed 2 lives and left a family shattered, was devastating. The human mind struggles with such dissonance, when actions that seem right in isolation result in catastrophic consequences. For Billy, this was a daily emotional trial. Friends describe him during this period as somber, reflective, and unusually quiet. The once vibrant humorist now carried an almost palpable shadow. Interviews were measured, public appearances subdued, each interaction filtered through the lens of what he knew, what he had promised, and what had occurred. Humor, his lifelong refuge, became a delicate tool. Laughter was possible, but always layered with the weight of grief. It's also reported that Billy revisited every subtle sign he had noticed over the years. The small behaviors Rob exhibited, the anxiety he sensed in Michelle, the minor adjustments in household routines, all of it now read differently in hindsight. Moments once dismissed as quirks or stress signals now bore the haunting clarity of premonition. And Billy, as the only person who knew the full extent of Rob's fears, carried the invisible map of what had been hidden from the world. Guilt, in this case, was intertwined with responsibility. Billy had not acted on the dream itself. He had no legal authority, no mandate, no way to intervene beyond moral guidance. Yet he carried the internal debate relentlessly. Would speaking up earlier have changed anything? Could intervention have prevented the tragedy? The human mind is notoriously unforgiving in these scenarios, replaying possibilities endlessly, imagining what if after what if, despite the impossibility of knowing the answer. Even family and friends, though sympathetic, could not fully grasp the depth of his emotional burden. Loyalty, trust, and secrecy are intensely personal, and when combined with a tragedy of this magnitude, they create a private struggle invisible to the outside world. Billy's grief was therefore compounded. He mourned not only Rob and Michelle, but also the moral tension of silence, the decades of unspoken fear, and the haunting question of whether loyalty had come at an unanticipated cost. Reports suggest that he began journaling, reflecting privately, and seeking counsel in close confidants who could understand the ethical dilemma without judgment. Every reflection, however, brought with it the recurring echo of Rob's voice. "Promise me you won't tell." That phrase, once a simple reassurance of trust, became a haunting reminder of moral complexity. It's important to note the broader human lesson here. Trust is a double-edged sword. Loyalty is noble, yet silence in the face of danger, even when requested, can create profound moral dilemmas. Billy's experience is a case study in the psychological consequences of ethical tension, how promises, fear, and the unpredictable unfolding of events can converge to create a burden few can fully comprehend. And yet, even amidst this guilt, there was a commitment to truth. The confession, "I'm sorry I lied," was part of a process of moral reconciliation. It was an attempt to balance decades of loyalty with the ethical imperative to acknowledge what had been hidden. It was a recognition that truth, while painful, is a form of release, a means of honoring both the departed and the complex web of human relationships that define their lives. Billy's struggle with guilt also highlighted the complexity of human morality in extreme circumstances. It is easy to judge in hindsight, to question decisions, or to assign blame. But when promises, fear, and personal loyalty intersect, moral decisions are rarely simple. They are fraught with ambiguity, uncertainty, and profound emotional weight. Billy's reflections underscore this ambiguity, providing insight into the nuanced and painful calculus of human conscience. And yet, even with guilt as a constant companion, there remained moments of clarity.